Welcome to the T&T Real Estate Podcast, where we spark conversations that set you up for real estate success. I'm Tyler.
And I'm Tanya, and each week we bring you expert tips on navigating Northern Ontario's real estate market. Whether you're buying, selling, or investing, we've got the tools to help you thrive. So we are on the verge of spring 2025, and we're at the point where we might be getting into bidding wars again with home purchasers. So what are some winning strategies you as a potential home buyer can include in your offer in order for it to be accepted? We have 5 winning strategies for you here today.
Absolutely.
Tyler, you got the first question?
Yeah, so I think obviously number one is the conditions that you put in the offer, and the strongest offers usually have the least amount of conditions. So tip number one is to go in with an unconditional offer. Now, some people call it cash offers, unconditional offers, but it all technically means the same thing, and it means that there's no conditions in the offer. So as soon as the seller signs on the dotted line, it's a done deal. They can flip the sign. It's technically sold, and you're just waiting for closing after that. But obviously, there are risks that go along with unconditional offers, so you have to be prepared. So what are some of the risks that you can kind of go through with an unconditional offer?
Well, the risk in an unconditional offer is if you don't actually have the cash, the money, the funds, the backing to actually close on the deal, you could be in a position where something changes, right? Something changes in your life financially, your assets, or even some big change in the economy, interest rates, etc. And that makes you unable to close a deal. And if you are in that position, you'd be in breach of contract, and it's a huge liability potentially. But I think, a lot of buyers, if you do have the funds to go behind it and you do have the backing of, a mortgage broker, and you've got that approval in place, plus you have significant down payment to cover maybe a shortfall that might happen in an appraisal, then maybe you're willing to take the risk. So I think it's always important that you evaluate your own risk tolerance. If, heaven forbid, something should happen and you can't close on a mortgage, for example, do you actually have the funds to back it up, or can you get those funds a different way to close on the deal?
Absolutely.
Yeah, it can be very risky.
It can, especially, and that's just the financing part. Then you can go into a home inspection. Have you had a home inspection? Should the property have a home inspection? But the most important thing, to kind of mitigate that risk, you can have a pre-inspection. All the home inspectors in Sudbury are doing those these days. They're a little bit cheaper. You don't necessarily get the full document that you would for a full inspection, but they go over the 5 main areas of a house and make sure that, foundation, HVAC is all kind of up to par. So there are ways to mitigate that, especially before the offer goes in. But I would think the number one risk of a cash offer is the financing piece of it, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. It's important that you do your due diligence ahead of time, like not only mitigating your risks, but also, doing the inspection ahead of time, doing the due diligence to make sure that you feel comfortable with that purchase. Sometimes people can get a little bit carried away a bit too much in their emotions, and they're not looking at the practical side. How much upkeep is this property going to need over the next few years? Is it going to need a new roof, a new furnace, something that's going to be quite expensive to replace should it, require replacing in the next few years? So that's where, like you mentioned, that pre-inspection, pre-offer inspection can really help mitigate your risks if you're going to do an unconditional offer. And going in, with a full knowledge of what this property is going to require over the next few years and the money it's going to take to maintain it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we talked about financing, being a risk, certainly having an inspection being important. What are some other things that we typically put in an offer, but you might sort of take out of an offer, let's say, if you wanted it to be unconditional?
Okay, so the only other condition that we can talk about is the insurance condition. So, you can get an insurance quote at any time, really. It's not that big of a deal, but you have to make sure the property is actually insurable. Most of them are. It's just about how much money you actually pay to the insurance company. But I think, getting that quote, making sure, give them the address, give them all the details, and they'll come back with a quote probably usually the same day or the day after. So that's not a huge condition. That's not a huge worry, but it is one,
important,
it's
right?
important to make sure that you can actually get insurance for that property. I've only ever seen in the 10 years one property that hasn't been able to get insurance, and there was an oil tank buried in the backyard. But besides that, I mean, everything is technically insurable. It just depends how much the cost that you're going to pay.
We actually ran into an issue with the property we purchased in British Columbia where the roof was really, really old, and we knew it when we were buying the place. So we had a roofer lined up for after we purchased it to get that taken care of. But that was one of the things we were able to get insurance to close it, because you need to have insurance to get your mortgage at the closing table, or the lawyers won't allow the funds to transfer. But we had sort of an exclusion on the roof for a certain period of time until we proved that we had the roof done. So sometimes things like that happen, and it's a bit of a risk. Sure, if something had happened, requiring the roof replacement during that term before we got it replaced, it wouldn't have been covered under insurance, but everything else was, and we were able to close the deal. So
sounds good.
Yeah, that's really important.
All right, what's tip number 2?
Okay, so this is I think this is a very controversial item. It is known as the love letter, the home buyer love letter. I love your home love letter. Letters that sometimes a buyer would put forward towards a seller to say, this is who we are. We love your home. We can imagine ourselves living here. I think it's controversial. So question to you, Tyler, do you think these love letters actually work?
I think they do work, but they have to be, there's certain scenarios that they'll work. So if let's say you have 2 offers in a multiple offer or bidding war situation, if you have an offer at $400,000 and you have an offer at $450,000, the $400,000, doesn't matter how good the love letter is not gonna help you. Mm-hmm. But if you have 2 offers at $450,000 with similar conditions or no conditions with similar closing dates, the love letter might just bump that offer up above the other one. They might fall in love with what you have to say and the picture of your beautiful golden retriever, whatever it is, and you might just get that property from the love letter. So I think they can work, but the offers have to be semi-similar.
I think the one good thing about the love letter is it sort of demonstrates that the buyer has already emotionally moved themselves into the home. So I think if I'm looking with my home seller, we're looking at 2 offers. And like you said, if they're very close to one another, one has a letter saying, I love your house, and the other one doesn't say that, you might say, okay, these people are more likely to follow through on the purchase because they've already moved themselves in emotionally, mentally. They love it, right? But I think there's a huge problem here. And actually, so these are actually, it's illegal in the US. Maybe not anymore now that things are changing in the US with respect to diversity, equity, inclusion. But in the US, these letters are actually banned. So they do tend to discriminate against certain groups of people, right? Because we know people like to sometimes see themselves in the people who are buying their homes, if it's an emotional sale as well, right? You want to see that it's another family starting out, but that's very discriminatory towards, new Canadians, people who have different family dynamics. And I think it's very important to just be aware of that, right? I mean, if we keep housing in the hands of those who are privileged and don't allow people to get in because of what their name looks like on paper or the letter that they write that explains their different family dynamic, it will become an issue that moves forward in our society. So I think I don't like the practice myself because I do feel it can be discriminatory. And I actually had one instance where a love letter came forward and my clients were like, you know what, we actually don't really like these people.
Really?
We don't
got turned off by it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah, they were trying to use it as an emotional tactic, and my clients were very much more practical, and they were of the mindset that we're not going to be swayed by this sort of emotional letter.
Interesting.
Yeah, so it actually it did almost backfire. We still managed to negotiate the deal on that one, but I think it kind of put up a barrier that the seller was just a little bit more steadfast in their ways.
Interesting. So I actually have the opposite example. So I was selling a house of the family. Their mother had passed away, so it was the kid selling the house, and the house has been in the family for years and years, and then there was 5 offers, 2 that were very close, but they actually took an offer $5,000 lower with a love letter because they wanted to see it go to a young family that wanted to make it their family home for a
Okay,
while.
you know what? I have another thing to add to that.
Okay.
I watch The Housewives. I don't know if you watch The Housewives, but there's this woman, Bozoma Saint Jean, and she was actually an amazing, Netflix executive. She's been on so many. She's a really, really amazing, smart woman.
I know exactly
And
the story
she
you're going to tell.
she
Yes, go
spoke
ahead.
at one of our real estate conferences several years ago. We saw her. She was fantastic, and she lost her house recently in the LA fires, and it was really, really sad. One of her homes, I believe, she has more than one home. But she went through and said, as a Black woman in America, what she had to do to get this home as a single mother, Black woman in America, living in a gated community, she had to hide her purchasing this home inside a trust, so that she would be allowed to purchase this home.
Mm-hmm. Because the neighbors wanted to know who was moving in.
Exactly.
Really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah. It's awful. So I think it's very important that we recognize that other people face these barriers to home entry. And I think it's our job as realtors to help get everybody into housing and to help them.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Awesome.
On to tip number 3.
Number 3.
All right. So tip number 3 is the amount that you put down for a deposit. So obviously it's a sliding scale, and we kind of talked about this before the show, but if you put if there's 5 offers, you're not necessarily going to go with the amount that's the highest deposit. Chances are you're going to go with the amount that's the highest price. But the second thing down on that first piece of paper is the amount of deposit you put down. Mm-hmm. So if you have a deposit that's $1,000 and it's the exact same offer as a deposit that's $10,000, the person putting down $10,000 is way more, into buying this deal than the $1,000. Anybody could walk away from $1,000, but when it goes up to $10,000, you might think twice about walking away from the deal. Now, if you're going from $10,000 to $20,000, it's not as big as the gap from 1 to 10, but I think it's still important. So especially when you're buying in the higher price ranges, the more the deposit that you put down, obviously the better. Mm-hmm. So I think that's definitely a plus in the bidding war process for sure.
Yeah, definitely the higher deposit helps somebody appear serious and qualified as well, right? Because they're going to be coming up with that actual cash amount in the next 24 to 48 hours and putting it as a down payment. So if, like you said, if someone's just putting $1,000 or $1,500 down on a property, it's very easy for somebody who's in a firm and binding deal to then not close and walk away from that money, right? It's a very small loss. But if someone's putting $20,000, $30,000 down, that they're serious and they're more likely to close on that property.
So let's say the average price in Sudbury is $475,000. Mm-hmm. What do you think is the minimum deposit that you should put down in a bidding war?
I say 5 is minimum on any offer. Anything below 5,000 is, to me, it's like, why can't you come up with $5,000 if you're going to be putting 20 or more down eventually.
So what do you think would be where do you think it starts getting eye opening to?
I think you need to be. I think if you're bidding in a bidding war, 10 is probably a good number, and it may get more enticing for a seller. I'd say maybe at like 20. Yeah. Okay. How do you feel about those numbers?
I was going to say 20. Yeah. 20 was my number for sure.
Yeah. I think 20 solid.
And I mean, especially if you know that you're putting at least 5% down, you could technically put that deposit in there. Mm-hmm. But
you have an interesting story, right? What is the highest down payment deposit you've had a client?
So was it 2 years ago? Maybe 3 years ago now, I had a client that was purchasing a property for $450,000. I think it was listed at $399. We were going at $450, and they wanted to put 100% of the purchase price down as a deposit, just to show how serious they were. So I said, I kind of reeled them back from there. I obviously that was overkill, and probably there was some liability with that as well. But I think we came down to, it was either 50 or 75,000 that we ended up putting down, and we ended up getting the property. So it worked.
That's maybe a little bit, I wouldn't say, it's maybe not too much, but it's a little overkill. You don't necessarily need to put that down as a deposit. And it can be tricky sometimes, right, to get those funds out of trust. If for some reason the deal doesn't close, let's say there's a title issue that's discovered prior to closing and the lawyers are trying to work something out and figure it out. it's hard to have that kind of money on the line
Yeah.
when you're trying to resolve something like that. So I think a decent amount of deposit is great. It means both parties are going to try to come to a resolution if there's something like that at the closing table that's discovered, or prior to, hopefully.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's important to have you don't need to put the whole purchase price down.
Yeah.
That's pretty cool.
All right. What's tip number 3?
Tip number 3 is to be flexible with the closing. So sometimes it's not just about money for sellers. You're going through a lot when you're selling a home. It's a big upheaval with probably more than one person involved, all of your stuff, your animals. It can be very stressful. And if you can be flexible with the seller's closing date, it can help them maybe choose an offer. Maybe they'll take a bit of a lower offer if the closing date is what they want, right? So, what do you think, Tyler? How can a purchaser make the closing date attractive to a seller?
So I mean, obviously the most attractive is just leaving the closing date open and letting them choose themselves whether they need 3 months, 5 months, or 2 weeks. But that obviously has some liability behind that as well. You have to be prepared to move as quickly or as slow as the seller wants in that scenario. But I'm actually going through an offer right now where we're giving them 6 weeks to find a house. And if they don't find a house in that 6 weeks, we're giving them an additional month until we have to obviously negotiate again. But I mean, when somebody is selling a house that needs to go somewhere else, I think that's one of the most important. They don't know where they're going yet, so they need as much time as possible. And even if they don't need it, they could find a house next week and we can, have our closing dates all set up. But having it as flexible as possible, as you can make it, because you might have a house to sell as well. But I think that's one of the most important. I would say it was probably second most important after purchase price, obviously. But yeah, closing date is very important.
Yeah. I think, it's very important to understand the needs of that home seller. And you understood that really well, right? This seller needed to find another place to move to. And to give them 30 days, they might feel a little anxious, but the way you wrote it was very creative in that they had a lot of time and you could adjust the closing if needed. And then they could get an extra extension if they wanted to. So that's,
absolutely.
Really smart.
So do you have any other creative ways to go about it?
So what I like to do is, if it works for both parties, if it works for your buyer, certainly, is to leave the closing date blank. But we have a clause that sort of inserts like an asterisk and adds to our schedule the time frame that could work, right? So if you have a buyer that's like, okay, well, we can close anytime between, March 1st and March 15th, and then, maybe they're going on March break holiday, they don't want to close during that period, then we'll write in a clause that details very thoroughly what days they can close. So say between March 1st and 15th, and then from, April 1st to June 1st. And then you allow the seller to pick a time within that works. But then I also always add an extra clause that says, we allow the seller 3 days to choose their closing date. So it gives them a lot of time to sort of mull it over and figure out like what's going to work for them. And failing which, let's say they don't choose a closing date, we certainly don't want to jeopardize our deal. Then we have, failing which the X date shall be the date of closing and X should be the date of the title search.
Gotcha.
Yeah. Anyway, it's all good conversations to have with your realtor to sort of figure out the timeline and what's going to work for you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so the last tip number 5, is just being flexible with the terms in the offer and also the chattels. So obviously we had flexibility with closing. This is, staying more flexible on other aspects of the offer. So I think obviously flexible with the amount of conditions we put in that we've kind of already covered, but obviously chattels. So I always recommend to our agents that you call the listing agent just to find out what the lay of the land is with the sellers. What are they attached to in the house? What are they not attached to? If 2 or 3 offers come in at the exact same price with the exact same deposit with the exact same closing date, the next thing is obviously chattels that are being included. So what do they want to, like, is there a hot tub that they might want to leave, but they actually really kind of want to take with them? So being flexible with those types of,
Yeah.
those types of
It's
things.
those little things. I mean, you think they're little, but sometimes they mean a significant amount to a home seller. So it's being flexible with those little things and finding out, like you said, ahead of time, what's really important to that home seller. They might include all the appliances in the listing and say the washer, dryer, everything's included. But, once you ask them, they're like, well, we really love our washing machine and we actually want to take it with us. It's funny. I find a lot of people want to take their washers and dryers with them more than their fridges or stoves, which is a bit odd.
It's hard to find a good one these days.
Good washing machine.
Especially the 30-year-old ones.
Yeah. So have you ever seen anything oddly negotiated in a deal as a chattel?
Absolutely. So I sold a place out east of Sudbury. It was there's 5 acres of land, but when we showed up, there was a little chicken farm. So we actually negotiated over the amount of chickens that was left with the house and the amount of roosters. Because I guess there's a certain amount of, there's a equation that you need to have a certain amount of roosters for the amount of chickens that you have. So we negotiated that they leave 5 chickens and 1 rooster. And I'm not sure if that equation even makes sense to somebody that knows what they're talking about. But that's probably the most odd things I've negotiated over were chickens and roosters.
I don't think I've ever had a live animal or livestock in an offer.
You know what? It wasn't part of my deal, but thinking about it now, I had an agent in my old office that there was a deal that was blowing up. They couldn't come to an accepted deal over a bar fridge.
Oh my goodness.
Because the buyers really wanted it, but the sellers, I think it came down to principle at that point. They were just like, you know what, you're going to nickel and dime us over a bar fridge. Yeah. So they ended up going their separate ways.
And that's where the agent steps in and says, I will buy you a bar fridge on closing.
Yes. I'll buy you 2 of them.
The deal happen, right? It's a couple $100 maybe at most. Yeah. And that's kind of silly. It's too bad sometimes when people get a little entrenched in their negotiations.
Absolutely. So these are obviously 5 good tips for moving into the spring market and markets beyond. You never know how crazy it is, especially with the market that we came out of the last couple of years. So we hope that you have gained some knowledge out of this, and we will see you on the next episode.
Thanks for tuning in to the TNT podcast. If you've enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to leave us a comment, subscribe, and share with a friend who might be interested in real estate.
We'll catch you next time, and until then, stay ahead in real estate.